Coffee is sweeter than 1,000 kisses. So, we're talking about coffee. That was Bach's Coffee Cantata. Please do listen to it all. Coffee is a little different than most of the drinks we have discussed thus far because it is not fermented, it's not distilled either, but it's just an infusion. Hot water and red ripe berries, or cherries as they are called. It's a little shrub that's native to the mountains of Ethiopia. So it's and there are actually a couple of different kinds of coffees. Two types: coffee arabica, which is fairly delicate and full flavored, people say. And then there is robusta, which is a hardier plant. Its seeds contain a little more caffeine. It's what goes usually into the cans of things like Maxwell House and so forth. The flavor, people say, is a little harsher. The berries are found inside of what's called the cherry, that little red thing. There are two coffee beans inside each one. Of course, it's not a bean, it's not a legume at all. We just call it that because they kind of look like beans. And these can either be ground dry and actually still green. In fact, in Yemen, they still do it that way. Or you can roast them and then grind them and then filter the infusion, which is the way most of us are familiar with it. But there are other kinds. You know, in Turkey, for example, they will grind the coffee and then add hot water, and the grounds stay at the bottom of the cups. You have this kind of sludge at the bottom, which is much more full flavored. And then you can also get a bit of light froth at the top. It's just quite a different experience. Coffee, I think, is also very different from these other things we've spoken about in that it is a flavoring in its own right. Right? It's used in confections and cakes and ice cream flavor, right? And thanks to its caffeine content, it is, unlike almost everything we've spoken about thus far, it's a stimulant. And you could argue it's also addictive. You use coffee every morning, and one morning you wake up and don't have any, it will certainly give you a headache and make you drowsy. So as such, as a drug, first encountered in early modern Europe, it was something that was exotic and alluring, but I want to focus on the fact that it was also an alternative to alcohol in the Reformation era, a drink that kind of perked you up and made you lively rather than dulling your senses and making you drowsy. And of course, remember, we have much stronger forms of alcohol now in distillates, so coffee provides the remedy that presumably these hard drinks will provide. So the timing of its introduction to Europe, its sudden popularity, I think reveals a much greater cultural shift and a very new attitude towards sobriety, which I would argue fits in perfectly with the so-called Protestant work ethic. And I think, you know, this goes back to Max Weber. A stereotype, his ideas were certainly oversimplified, but to some extent it's true that in the modern capitalist world, work is something we value very, we consider it the essence of our being. When you meet someone, you ask, what do you do, right? And the more you do of it, the more successful you are, the better a person you are. That we judge people based on their work success, right? And of course, in a capitalist world, anything that's going to help you be successful and stay awake and be productive is going to be really valued. Coffee fits perfectly, okay? And we'll take a look at some of the unique institutions that grow up in early modern Europe, such as the coffee house, which is not really the forerunner of Starbucks. It's actually more important than that. It's a place for social gathering. It's a place where business is conducted, for example. So another topic I will talk about today, because it kind of follows from the last one, is the place of coffee in changing medical theory of the 17th century. and how a new empirical scientific attitude, a new mechanical means of evaluating drugs promotes coffee very effectively, just like alcohol before it. And coffee makes the same shift, going from a quasi medicinal to ultimately a purely recreational beverage. Um, so let's start with the earliest use of coffee, though. According to legend, coffee was first discovered in the 9th century by a young goat herd named Kaldi in the hills of Ethiopia. This little goat herd notices his goats frolicking with unusual vigor after munching on the red berries of a bush that grew around the place. So young Kaldi decided, let me try them. And it gave him a buzz that he liked. And supposedly then he shared it with others. And this was a story invented actually several centuries later. That's the first time it appears in print. And it's actually only recorded in the 17th century. So it's almost it's 800 years later. But it's, for some reason, as with most drugs, the idea is that someone found this by accident. And that's the truth with most medicinal plants and hallucinogenics and everything. Is there's a myth about someone stumbling on it and saying, "Ooh, this is wonderful, let's all use it." But the origins of the drink itself, also actually mythical, really. Go back to a guy named Sheikh Omar, who was banished from Mocha. Pay attention to that word Mocha. It's a city in Yemen. Okay, we have a very different meaning of it today, but it's then and to this day associated with coffee. So anyway, Sheikh Omar found himself wandering desperately looking for something to eat, and he tasted these very same berries, these red berries, and goes, "Ooh, this is nasty, this is bitter, ugh, awful." So he tried cooking them, and then he found, oh, these are too hard, they're just nasty, awful. So he said, well, I'm so hungry, what do I do? So he smashed them, and then he added water to them out of desperation because he didn't want to eat the dry powder. And then all of a sudden he notices, these are now aromatic, and the liquid that came off of these is delicious. And suddenly he felt revived, and miraculously his hunger pangs disappeared, which is, of course, one of the traits of caffeine. It subdues hunger. So he shared this with others, and the word got around to his compatriots back in Mocha, and they invited him back to the city and have been drinking coffee ever since. And Mocha, not coincidentally, would become one of the great trading ports for coffee. I have no idea how it eventually became to mean coffee with chocolate flavoring. Originally it just means coffee. Just the same way as you say a cup of mocha or a cup of Java, is where the Dutch grow it in Indonesia. And I'll explain how it gets there. That's another story. But there has been this long debate whether coffee was mentioned by the great Arab physician Rhazes, or Al-Razi is his name in Arabic. This is the 900s, because he says there's this plant, and he mentions it, he describes it, calls it bun, or buncombe. And he says it's hot and dry, it's good for the stomach, and you'll remember the humoral physiology we discussed. And these are words that are still used to this day for coffee in Ethiopia. Now, we're not really sure what Rhazes was talking about, but he may have been talking about a different plant, and now that word bun means coffee. We're not sure. Avicenna, who's another Galenist Arab philosopher, mentions bun as well. And even if it was another plant that he actually had in mind, European scholars who used these texts when they recovered them in the late Middle Ages thought that Rhazes and Avicenna knew coffee. And they cite them as authorities. Whenever you hear someone talking about coffee, they'll say, oh, Avicenna says this, and they assume he is talking about coffee. Now, what's strange about it is, if that is the case, there is no mention of coffee until 5 centuries later. So there's this weird gap through most of the Middle Ages, and the first recorded use of coffee is in the 15th century in Yemen, where the drink's invention is usually attributed to a guy named Muhammad al-Dabani, who's a Sufi scholar who died about 1470. So this is the same time as the Renaissance in Europe. And apparently why they were using coffee is the Sufis took the ban on alcohol very seriously, which again leads me to believe Omar Khayyam might not have been a Sufi, right? But in any case, these Sufis took the ban seriously, and they thought that if we're not going to be drowsy with wine, then the stimulating effect of coffee is a really good substitute. It helps us stay awake. We could stay up late at night and pray and work and think, and there's no reason to avoid this wonderful drug. So the drink actually spread through the Muslim world specifically as an alcohol substitute, but also as a social stimulant. In other words, you would take this with friends, you'd sit around in a coffee house, and it was something you could do respectably in the open. Unlike alcohol, if you drank it, you do it quietly, so no one really criticizes you, and you do it, in secret. Here, you could do this in the open. You don't have to do it surreptitiously like you would wine. And the sudden popularity of the drink naturally led the religious authorities to question, is this really something, is coffee an intoxicant? Is it like wine? Is it a drug? And should it be banned like alcohol? And in fact, the word, strangely enough, the word kahwa, which is where we get the word coffee, it's kafwa, actually does mean wine in Arabic. So it seems really strange that they would confuse coffee and wine or put them in the same category. But they're things that alter your mind. I think that's what they're thinking of. And the authorities in Mecca first banned it. They thought this is potentially dangerous. One Ka'ir Beg proclaimed that the vendors should be closed down, all the remaining coffee burned, and then when he found out that people were writing satirical verses against him in these coffee houses, and he thought, this is politically subversive. We can't let people gather together in coffee houses. Whatever the drug is, let's get rid of it. It actually didn't work, and then people removed him from office. And the larger fear, again, I don't think it's really the coffee itself or the potential effect it's going to have on people. I think they're really afraid of political discussions. And we'll see that coffee and politics go very work very closely together. And there were further attempts to close them in the early 16th century. Those failed, and coffee houses start popping up anyway. So there's coffee houses in Mecca and Cairo by about 1500, in Constantinople by 1555, or I should say Istanbul. It's now owned, it was taken over in the preceding century by the Turks. So Europeans get there, and they are curious about this new drug. A guy named William Budulph, an Englishman traveling there in 1609, says their coffee houses are more common than ale houses in England. If there be any news, it is talked of there. Okay, so this is their kind of little beds of sedition and news. George Sandys in Egypt in the next year, 1610, said, although they be destitute of taverns, they have there coffee houses, which something resemble them. There they sit chatting most of the day and sip of a drink called coffee, of the berry that is made of in little china dishes, as hot as they can suffer it, black as soot, and not tasting much unlike it. So in other words, he tasted coffee and he said, this is gross. It tastes like soot and looks like it. So these are this is really the way the West encountered coffee, at least the earliest ones. There are other ones. Leonard Rauwolf, a German botanist traveling in the Levant, described the plant in his Travels in the Orient. This is 1582. It's a little older, in fact. And he describes chaube. I'm not sure I guess gets that word out of coffee, but he says, in the city of Aleppo, if you have a mind to eat something or drink other liquors, there is commonly an open shop where you sit down upon the ground or carpets and drink together. Among the rest, they have a very good drink, but by them called chaube, which is almost black as ink, and very good in illness, chiefly that of the stomach. Of this they drink in the morning, early in open places, before everybody, without any fear or regard, out of china cups, as hot as they can. He says that too, which is interesting. And they often put it to their lips, but drink but a little at a time, and let it go round as they sit. Now notice that in this, I find the most fascinating, is he doesn't understand this concept of drinking a hot liquid out of a cup by little sips. There's nothing that you would do that with in Europe. You know, they have soup, but they use a spoon, and then they drink out of it, out of a bowl. But a little cup with something hot, drinking out of, that's utterly foreign. Okay, very interesting, isn't it? A couple of years later, the Venetian traveler to Constantinople, or I should say again, Istanbul, had very little good to say about it. He says, all these people are quite base, of low custom and very little industry, such that for the most part they spend their time sunk in idleness. Thus they continually sit about, and for entertainment they are in the habit of drinking in public shops, in the streets, a black liquid, boiling as they can stand it, which is extracted from a seed they call cafe, and it is said to have the property of keeping a man awake. So people, Europeans are getting a little news about this stuff, and it's not always positive, but they're thinking this is a drug. It does something strange. It keeps people awake. And both of these are interesting because they point to how it keeps people from working, which is exactly the opposite of what it becomes in the West. And also, they are amazed at this whole notion of drinking something hot from a cup. Seems really weird to them. And the point that I really want to drive home at this point is that Europeans had no stimulants. They had nothing. They had no idea of this. And so the idea of something that keeps you awake, that you drink, and drinking it hot in a little cup, this is really utterly foreign to them, and fascinating and alluring and weird. Okay, so how does coffee get to Europe, and why does it ultimately catch on? Well, especially since by all accounts the first taste of coffee by these Europeans, and I guess you could say by everyone, is negative. No one likes coffee to start with, right? It's bitter, it's nasty, it's even when you put sugar in it, it's got a really kind of it's not a flavor that you would like on your first try. And basically what happened is a little bit of history. The Ottoman Empire was expanding. In 1536 they conquered Yemen, and they said, let's get this lovely stuffed coffee throughout the empire from the city of Mocha, right, where we talked about before. So coffee you could get in the early 16th century in Alexandria, in the Levantine ports, which is now the sort of Israel and Lebanon, and there were so merchants, Venetian merchants who are trading in those ports are going to see coffee, notice it, and they'll think, let's bring this back to Europe. Maybe someone there is going to want it. And the merchants were actually very careful not to sell fresh beans to the Venetians. They roasted them first because their fear, well, the Venetians are just going to plant this stuff and then they're not going to need us, right? That's a very, it's understandable for a merchant. So apparently they weren't careful enough because a Muslim pilgrim smuggled some seeds. This is Baba Budan is his name. Taped 7 seeds to his chest and brought them to southern India. And in fact, when the Dutch get to India, this is 1616, they find them growing there and they say, oh, let's use these. Let's plant them in our colonies here, Ceylon. By the end of the century, Java. Throughout the Dutch East Indies, these are plants that were smuggled out of the Middle East to India, and the Dutch plant them in Indonesia. That's why we have Java, okay, cup of joe. Long before then, the Italians had been drinking, again through these Venetians, to such an extent that they were importing it. These are roasted beans, that it caught the attention of Pope Clement VII, who was actually asked to ban the drink. So this happens before 1605. That's when he died, and so the story goes that he tasted this stuff, and he said, "Why, this Satan's drink?" Everyone told him, "Ban this stuff. It's made by the devil. This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it. So we shall fool Satan by baptizing it and making it a truly Christian beverage." That's, of course, probably nonsense, but he did approve of it, okay? And by the mid-17th century, coffee was being sold in the streets in Italy. Venice got its first proper coffee house in 1683. So I want you to realize that the timing here, this is sort of the Baroque, okay, the era of Versailles and of the Restoration in England, okay. And in fact, in England, they do coffee houses start popping up too. Oxford and London each have coffee houses in the 1650s. In 1669, the Turkish ambassador in Paris, Soliman Aga, began the fashion for drinking coffee there too, and he started throwing lavish parties where men would laze around on cushions wearing these long dressing gowns and sip coffee out of these little handleless cups. So it became rather popular. And in 1689, so popular that the Café Procopius is the name, opened in Paris across from the Comédie Française. And if you go to Paris, it is still in business. You can go in the very same building. It's still there. It's packed with tourists, but it's a fun place. And it really is the same spot, same exact business. Its original popularity is it was a place for writers and actors to hang out, and I guess even in that day, tourists really would go, let's try the exotic coffee. This will be fun. So it has been argued by a sociologist whose name I really love. I don't know why. It's his Wolfgang Schivelbusch. Okay, he's decided. He wrote a book called The Tastes of Paradise, and argued that coffee caught on, particularly in Protestant countries, because they have this strong work ethic. There's an incentive to stay alert for long hours and make money, and that's sort of the cultural ideal. And this is to be contrasted with Catholic countries such as Spain, where chocolate really catches on. Drinking chocolate, I'm talking about, because it's more relaxing, and it is a drink that fits the idle elite. They're the wealthy nobles. They just flaunt their wealth, build palaces, sit around and sip chocolate, and really don't care about working. I let the lower people do all the work. Now that's a stereotype, obviously, and it doesn't fit every model, doesn't fit every country. Italians love coffee from the very start, and they're not Protestant, and they don't have that same work ethic that you'll find in Northern Europe. But it does, I think, perhaps explain why Northern Europeans chose coffee as a morning beverage and a midday beverage, and beer and wine are now pushed till after work. The idea that you would drink while working, it becomes a little suspect. And of course there are times and places where there are exceptions to that, the martini lunch, of course, 3 martini lunch or 2, whatever it is. But clearly why coffee catches on in Europe as a stimulant is that it was preferable to something that's going to make you a little tipsy at breakfast or midday, and hence the whole idea of a coffee break. Of course, you take that break, but you're wiring up again, okay? So I think the importance of coffee, I think, is also conceptually and gastronomically linked to the advent of breakfast itself as a proper meal. If you will recall, in the Middle Ages, dinner, which was the largest meal of the day, was taken at about 11 o'clock, a little later in cities, and it always includes wine or beer, right? Alcohol is necessary. Now, very slowly, what happens is these caffeinated drinks begin to replace them, and dinner moves later into the afternoon. Supper is the smaller meal, right, in the evening. And as dinner migrates to 3 to 4 to later to 5, it became custom. People were hungrier earlier, right? Because you'd have your big meal 5-ish, and you'd have a little supper maybe later, but you wake up in the morning, you're hungry. And so the word, the word dinner has a really bizarre etymology. Let me share it with you. The word dinner actually means breakfast. It's the thing that you break your fast with. Disjejunare in Latin, déjeuner in French, dîner in English in medieval French, and then in English we get that word. It's just a contraction of déjeuner, dîner. And so dinner means to break the fast. It's breakfast. Really weird. But what happens, of course, dinner migrates all the way into toward the end of the day. Dinner and supper become interchangeable, really. One means formal, the other a little informal, but they need breakfast. And the drink, of course, is for proto-capitalists with this Protestant work ethic, is a stimulant, so you can remain alert all day and transact business. And it's true that they were promoted as temperance drinks, and equally true that suppliers of beer and wine had a vested interest in stopping the popularity of coffee, right? Because it's competition for them, and they think people are drinking this coffee, they're not drinking beer in the morning. So to start, there is a kind of war between alcohol and caffeine, and it's waged largely in the medical literature. And in a nutshell, let me just give you an idea of what happened. We have one physician who's paid off by the wine syndicate. We have one merchant who peddles his wares to anyone, but using medical arguments. One royal physician trying to sell his superior coffee and his new invented coffee machines. Remember, if you're selling coffee, selling the machine, the equipment is really smart too. Think of Keurig, right? And the list goes on, okay? There's a whole mess of people, all of whom either want you to stop drinking coffee or drink it, but their arguments are, drawn from all over the place. Everyone has an ulterior motive for what they're arguing, is what I'm saying. Then, as of course today. And each makes use of medical studies that best suit his own case. They cite authorities, whether that's Galenic, iatrochemical, iatromechanical. That means to cure through the means of chemistry with chemicals. Iatromechanical means an understanding of the body through physics. How do our arms work? How are we like a machine? These separate new schools of physiology begin to think about what coffee does to us. Okay, this is what really interests them. And here I'm going to have to discuss all caffeinated drinks together, because actually these physicians do. And later I'll come back to tea and chocolate in the next two lectures. But let's start with these first text, major text. It's a German physician. His name is Simon Pauly, and it's a fascinating book called Commentarus de Abusu Tabaci Americanum Veteri et Herbae Teae Asiaticorum in Europo Novo, the abuse. Commentary on the abuse of tobacco, tea, coffee, and chocolate. All those are new drugs. And this is published in 1665. And it comes out, actually, there's an English translation if you want to see it. Simon Pauly, Paul L.L.I. Okay, easy enough. The translation is made in 1746. Much of the text is a botanical discussion of the plants, and in fact, he was botanist to the King of Denmark. He wrote a wonderful book called Flora Danica, which is the flowers of Denmark. But this book's main point is that comparable European herbs, Camellia, it's the same genus, myrtle, can actually take the place of tea for medicinal uses. And so he says, we've got plants like those. Hence, we have but little reason to bring tea from China, Tartary, and Japan at an extravagant price, which might be better laid out in relieving poor indigent families at home. It's really interesting, right? Why are you buying tea from China when we've got stuff that's very comparable? In fact, we don't. Europeans didn't have real tea. They had other camellia species. But of course, Pauly, is selling, or buying native herbs is going to profit him directly, right? So he's got a business as a pharmacist selling herbs. So obviously his argument is biased. That's what I'm trying to say. And as for the medical content of his denunciation, there had been some discussion in specialized medical circles about the precise humoral qualities of these new drinks. And the authorities generally agreed on certain effects that anyone could not help recognize. They're stimulating, they're astringent, meaning they make your tongue pucker, right? They dry it out. And then they serve as diuretics. They will actually cause liquid to flow out of your body. And those, incidentally, are still recognized as the basic properties of caffeine. Now, we understand how those things happen very differently today, but those are the basic properties. Nicholas Tulpius, and actually Tulp is very interesting. There's a portrait of him by Rembrandt, which is really, really lovely, him doing a surgery. But anyway, this is Tulp, added that tea removes headaches, stuffing of the head, inflammations, distillations of the eyes, difficulty breathing, weakness of the stomach, gripes of the intestines, and weariness. Now, what medical authorities could not agree on, and remember, they're talking about all the caffeinated drinks, is that what is the precise humoral makeup of these new things? Because if it's astringent and tannic, then it has an effect. It's dry, right? It's gonna dry out your body, like wine, right? Or in the same way, when we describe wine as dry, it means it doesn't have much sweetness. It causes your tongue to dry out, like a dry martini does too. Remember, that's a humoral understanding of dry. Some physicians said, well, coffee and tea are hot, and not only in temperature, but they actually heat up the body, right? While chocolate is cold. Chocolate cools you. Others claim that all three of these things, chocolate, coffee, tea, are all hot and dry. Others say that they artificially actually make the body colder because they're drying up the moisture in your body and the life fluid, and they will ultimately weaken you. They'll, dry out your eyes, they'll dry out your brain, you'll become a little feeble. And I'll go into these particular debates, but I want you to understand they're still based on Galenic theory that by this point goes back a millennium and a half, 1500 years, really. So Pauly's denunciation of these drinks is still in that tradition. He pays some lip service to the new emerging chemistry of the day. He claims that it's the sulfur in these drinks that makes them more heating than anything people are familiar with, including ginger and cinnamon and pepper, which we know burn on the tongue. But he's saying this sulfurous quality, when it goes into your body, it's going to heat you up like brimstone, I guess. And he claims that because these products violently dry out the body, they damage the moist organs, especially. They're going to damage your eyes, your brain, and of course the organs of reproduction. So you drink too much coffee, you'll become blind, dim-witted, and impotent, okay? It is the duty of every European to join in engaging the legislature to put a stop to this epidemical evil and prohibit the abuse not only of tea, but tobacco and coffee. Because they enervate European men, they become incapable of propagating their species like eunuchs, some of whom are highly salacious, but it is sufficiently known that they are incapable of procreation, though they emit something analogous to semen, is what he says. And I find this whole debate unbelievable, but I think people may have actually taken this seriously. And I don't know whether, let me read you a little English broadside that appeared in London in 1674. I don't know whether it's a joke or it's being serious, but it's definitely trying to scare you away from drinking coffee. This is appears in London in 1674. It's called the Women's Petition Against Coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniences accruing to their sex from the excessive use of the drying and enfeebling liquor. Okay, this is the humble petition and address of several thousands of buxom good women languishing in extremity of want. If you hadn't understood all of that 17th century English, it means they need to get some, and the men are not able to perform because they're drinking too much coffee. Okay, let me read it to you. It showeth that since 'tis reckoned among the glories of our native country, meaning England, to be a paradise for women, the same in our apprehensions can consist in nothing more than the brisk activity of our men, who in former ages were justly esteemed the ablest performers in Christendom. But to our unspeakable grief, we find of late a very sensible decay of that true old English vigor, our gallants being every way so Frenchified that they are become mere cock sparrows, fluttering things that come on sa-sa, that means sort of so-so, with a world of fury, but are not able to stand it, and in very first charge fall down flat before us. Never did men wear greater breeches, or carry less in them of any metal whatsoever, saying men cannot keep it up. There was a glorious dispensation, 'twas surely in the golden age, when lusty lads of 700 or 800 years old got sons and daughters, and we have read how a prince of Spain was forced to make a law that men should not repeat the grand kindness to their wives above 9 times a night. But alas, those forward days are gone. The dull lubbers want a spur now rather than a bridle, being so far from doing any works of supererogation, screwing. That means that we find them not capable of performing those devoirs which their duty and our expectations exact. The occasion of which insufferable disaster, after a serious enquiry and discussion of the point by the learned of the faculty, we can attribute to nothing more than the excessive use of that newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee, which, rifling nature of her choicest treasures and drying up the radical moisture, has so eunuched our husbands and crippled our more kind gallants that they are become as impotent as age and as unfruitful as those deserts where the unhappy berry is said to be brought. So whoever wrote this read something like Pauly or one of these medical tracts, and they're trying to say that because of the coffee drinking, our men have now don't perform in bed. In any case, these discussions are all still humoral, right? And I think the controversy actually gets much more interesting when all these new theories are applied to coffee. The chemical and mechanical arguments then come into play. And the authors then have an entirely different series of rationales. And they begin to look very closely at what coffee actually does to the body based on their professional experience. These are physicians. They're starting to think empirically. They're looking at the world and saying, let's get evidence before we jump to conclusions. And of course, what they're not depending on anymore is Galen. Okay, Galen very slowly gets dispatched. So the idea is that, and they know this well, coffee and tea do not cause impotence. They don't cause madness, and even in excess. But they do have real effects on the body. They really are a drug. Okay, of course, why they're in this course. And I'm going to focus on two French texts for the remainder of this talk. What is probably the most quoted of 17th century books extolling the virtues of caffeinated drinks. This is a lovely book. It's by a guy named Sylvestre Dufour, D-U-F-O-U-R. Le Traité nouveau et curieux du café, du thé et du chocolat. And this is 1685. It's a monstrous book. It's 450 pages, it's the most widely printed and read book about new caffeinated drinks. And what is interesting is that its author was actually a coffee merchant. So it's kind of an ad for these things. And he, of course, has many reasons to proclaim its benefits. But he also, to his credit, consults physicians that are his friends. And he's very well read. And he even manages to have a chemical analysis done of coffee to talk about its constituents, what it's made up of. What makes Dufour very interesting is that he went to Turkey. Okay? He knew its effect on the population that regularly consumes it. And he can avow that, and I'm quoting him here, this drink is not only very healthy, but even nourishing, which the savants attribute to the oleaginous humor naturally in coffee, which greatly sweetens the ferment, impeaches the stinging of membranes in the stomach, and furnishes substance proper to be converted into a nourishing juice which repairs the spirits. Now, this statement appears just within the first couple of pages of this treatise and immediately alerts the reader that a new set of dietary criteria will be employed here. He's not talking about four humors anymore. And his use of the term ferment to describe what's going on in the stomach and digestion harkens back to a very new way of understanding the human body that goes back to Van Helmont, the guy who coined the term gas. The physician Sylvius de la Boa, both of whom are key scientists in the scientific revolution. And in fact, we'll have a reason to come back to Sylvius because he's often credited with inventing gin. We'll come back to him. So in any case, what this text implies, what Dufour probably understands, is the role of acids in digestion. Okay, this is something that's not in the ancient literature. And his analysis of coffee will be at least partly chemical. He's still got humoral ideas floating around in his head, but he's trying to use the new science. Okay, and when I say partly, he doesn't abandon humoral descriptions entirely, and in fact, very few people of his day did. Certainly not in the popular mentality. It doesn't just disappear, but he was pretty much required to address this old question: is coffee hot and dry, or is it cold and dry? And he says he's pretty confused by this whole question. He explains this. I'll just read his words. I find myself embarrassed because the ancient authors of medicine and the greater part of aged persons who practice this art, in explaining the qualities of aliments, meaning food, and medicines, speak to us of hot, of cold, of dry, of humid. This is the whole humoral physiology. But moderns and young physicians support acid and alkali, salt, sulfur, mercury. This is the new chemistry. And Dufour wondered actually whether eventually they're going to come up with some new jargon that's going to replace all these, which of course happens, right? But he didn't want to disappoint his readers, so he asked the most moderate of his physician friends to help him on this matter. And following their opinions, he reassures his readers that there are some substances that either the Galenists or the chemists could not deny really do heat the body. Whether Galenism is complete nonsense, there are things that heat us. You drink eau de vie, you do have a spicy thing with pepper in it. I mean, it's going to actually physically heat your body, and of course, you even sweat if you take something really spicy. Okay? And he says there are things contrary that we know from empirical evidence that will refresh your body. Right? You eat lettuce or cucumbers, or you drink cold water or lemonade. I mean, even then, they knew lemonade cools and refreshes, and so does beer, actually. So he's saying, we shouldn't throw away the whole system because some of what they're talking about really does make empirical sense. But coffee, this is the weird thing, doesn't really have any apparent or extreme qualities. It's less hot than wine. It's not really cold and refreshing like lemonade. So, and Dufour says that, well, if we're going to try and give it some qualitative meaning, it's tempered. In fact, it has the power to cool people who are hot. I don't know how he gets that, but he says, yeah, and heat people who are cold. It's a ruse, of course, right? He's sidestepping the entire old argument and claiming coffee is actually good for everyone. So if you think it's hot and dry, don't worry. If you're also hot and dry, it's not going to be bad for you. If you're cold and moist, don't think of it as a medicine. It's good. It's good for all times. And of course, he's selling this stuff. So, and he says most authors insist on the contrary, that it is bitter and therefore it has to be hot and dry, and that's the humoral defense. But he's trying to say, no, it really isn't. And of course, it's boosting his own sales. That's behind here. So how he supports this idea, he undertakes a chemical analysis with a couple of friends. And one's an apothecary, the other's a physician, brings him some coffee and says, tell me what's going on in this. And I think, what they're doing is not so much what we would really recognize as a chemical analysis. It's more alchemical, but I think, certainly in the procedures, but they're trying, okay? And they start with brewed coffee, and then they distill this, and they get a clear water and vapors that condense into another, through the tube and then come out of the other end. And he says, well, coffee, look, it turns to steam very quickly. It must be volatile. But what he finds is that what's left behind is this oily, crass substance that is bitter and alkaline, which is really kind of weird. So the stuff that gets distilled got rid of the bitterness, but it's left in the force. So basically, they're separating the parts. You can see of the coffee, and saying it's got this weird alkaline bitterness. And he concludes, therefore, the coffee is volatile. Its particles are moving very, very rapidly. You can see he's using the new physics also. And that explains why it's aromatic. Its molecules, they don't have the word molecule yet, but the particles are moving quickly, and so they volatilize, they go up your nose. That's why coffee is aromatic. And also why it stimulates the body and prevents us from falling asleep. Remember, it's the molecules that are moving around quickly. When they go into our brain, they're going to make us excited and agitated and think more quickly because they'll do that inside of our brain. They're extremely light particles. They move around quickly. The bitterness has an aperient effect, meaning it opens the passages of your body. And what that means is it's going to push things along, right? It's going to open up obstructions. It's going to clear out your body. It's going to have a diuretic effect, pushing out the liquid, causing you to go to the bathroom. I mean, they've observed a lot of this stuff and are trying to explain it. He also says therefore, it has an affinity to our spirits. And that's a concept, idea of spirits I've spoken about before, right? It's very ancient. The most highly refined form of nourishment, remember? The same way that we use spirits to describe alcohol, distilled alcohol. It's the essence of food that has been refined in our body. And the way they describe it is food gets converted into chyle in the stomach, changed into blood in the liver, transported into the veins, converted into flesh. The rarefied parts are distilled and nourish our brain. And spirits, of course, that move quickly make us alert and vivacious. Ones that are sluggish or cause us to sleep. And that's when things slow down in there, you fall asleep. That's an ancient conception. But in the 17th century, is added to this is the idea that spirits are a kind of gas. Okay, that they're like the steam that comes off of the boiling liquid that's distilled. and that it flows through, another new idea is it flows through our nerve endings and it animates us, right? And in any case, because coffee is volatile and quick moving, it activates our spirits. That's why it's a stimulant. Okay, they're understanding this in very mechanical terms, not as a drug that's causing our body to speed up, but as something that, because it itself is quickly moving around, it's going to cause the ideas and the thoughts and things to move quickly in our brain. Because it's diuretic, it also helps flush out the superfluous fluids of the body, and it does not, as Simon Pauly claims, this is according to Dufour, dry out the body unless you take it in extreme excess. But rather, it dries up superfluous matter on the stomach, and Dufour says, therefore, helps contain the vapors which rise up to the brain, which makes you confused and clouded. So that's why it makes us alert, right? Because it's quick. Furthermore, it aids digestion in the stomach, which is called concoction, because it's constricting. If you put a little coffee on your tongue, and it has this effect that's called styptic. It dries it out and kind of makes it not puckering, but like a dry feeling on your tongue. And he claims that there's a chemical reaction that takes place in the stomach. Now, what Dufour doesn't do, he doesn't tell us, doesn't explain, give us a pH, for coffee itself. I don't think that system was even in use at this point. But he does clarify that alongside its subtle and volatile properties, it has some terrestrial parts, which he calls salts. This is what came out on the other end in the chemical analysis. And he says these are alkaline in nature, okay? And in fact, caffeine is alkaloid. So he's trying to explain the whole thing. And I want you to remember also, caffeine as a drug is not discovered until the 19th century. They have no idea that's what's really doing it. But his idea is that the alkali in coffee is going to temper a stomach that has too much acidity. And they understand, the role of pH, alkali and acid being opposite, is that you add alkali to your stomach, it's going to lower your, it's going to raise the pH and counteract the acid, right? It will sweeten the leaven, is what he says, at that stage of digestion. And people had really thought that digestion actually happened in the body, involved a kind of fermentation. Really, really interesting. I actually did a paper on this a couple years ago. I think it's published somewhere. It's online, actually. The fermentation is actually what separates the refined particles from the heavier wastes, or the fikes in Latin, the crude parts. Where I'm going with all this is, I think you should consider why we drink coffee at the end of a meal, okay, as a digestive stimulant, as something that's going to aid your digestion. It starts really here, okay? To this, Dufour adds what apparently is a mechanical function. He says the alkali absorbs the indigested matter, which can be transported through the body and sometimes coagulate there. Thus, it helps circulation of all the fluids in your body. It helps things move around. And he says, I'll quote here, which greatly aids the insensible transpiration which maintains health. And this is a weird idea. Another thing, oddly enough, I've wrote about ages ago, goes back to a physician named Santorio, who was writing in the early 17th century, founded this whole mechanical school of thinking. And his theory is that the proper passage of bodily fluids facilitates wastes going through the body, but also perspiration, the things that come through the pores in their body. And he actually measured the volume of this by measuring everything that went into his mouth and everything that comes out of him every single day for 30 years, and wrote a fascinating book called Medical Statistics based on this. But his theory was that if the flowing of these things, if the perspiration doesn't happen every day, you get diseases that clog your body. This is why obesity happens, why you get gout, gallstones, things like that. And so, with this very, very rational logic, coffee is prescribed for anyone who has diseases that were considered to be clogged. So gout, scurvy, women with menstrual problems, any kind of clog of the system, coffee was prescribed as a medicine. Now, my point is, my larger point, I know you're not going to recall all these bizarre physiological theories, but the point is that by selectively choosing elements from a number of rival physiological theories, Dufour could effectively argue that coffee will cure pretty much any illness. And what surprises me is that some of the diseases that he identifies and prescribes coffee for, caffeine is still used for those, which is really fascinating, I think. And it seems that he's drawing on extensive empirical evidence of prescribing coffee, and he's also drawing on the work of other physicians. And he makes what are really surprisingly rational and level-headed claims. Despite his completely different world outlook, right? For example, he says because coffee thins the blood, and all blood passes through the heart and lungs, coffee not only dilates the passages in the lung and chest, but helps make the blood flow through. It makes it less viscous and gummy. It thins it out. And so he says, I think with perfect logic, that coffee would be ideal for people who are suffering from asthma, for chest ailments, and a regimen of coffee would be great too if you're having trouble breathing. And in fact, modern medicine confirms this. Caffeine increases your respiratory rate, dilates your bronchial tubes. It does actually make breathing easier. So he stumbled on something that is still done today. Now again, he has completely different theoretical constructs, but presumably it was, kind of his just sort of daily practice and prescribing it for lots of people. And the ones with lung ailments came back and said, the coffee really worked. It was fine. And he wrote it down and said, and another one worked, another one. So you do discover things by accident, I guess. But I think it provides a kind of interesting corrective to my assertion that these authors are entirely self-serving and they're just making up anything to promote their business. They still do that, right? But their prescriptions actually, in this case, I think may have helped their patients too. Along these same lines, Dufour recommends coffee for maladies of the head, and he explains that volatile elements in coffee have a great similarity to our own spirits, specifying that it is nitrosulfurous compounds, that's saltpeter and sulfur mixed together, that have the same particle size and configuration as our own spirits, so it repairs them very quickly. And again, he's using his own experience as a guide. He says that if you suffer from migraines, coffee is going to be really useful. And once again, approved modern pharmaceutical use for caffeine is migraine headaches. Dufour relates the story of a woman who was taken to her surgeon. She had a horrible migraine headache, and the guy wanted to perform a trepanation to reduce the swelling. Trepanation is basically you either poke a hole in someone's head or you open the front of their skull and lift it out, and that reduces swelling, so they thought. And luckily, he says that a physician intervened and said, before you do any of this, let's try coffee. Let's give her a heavy dose of coffee. Within 3 days, she recovered. And now I don't know whether the prospect of poking a hole in her head said, "I'm better, don't do anything," or what. But the story is a nice illustration of how the mid-17th century is like right on the cusp of modern science. They're almost there. What they don't have is the analytical tools. They don't have scientific methodology yet, but they're groping around, and their initial instinct that coffee is a therapeutic drug is, of course, correct. Nonetheless, Dufour also makes some strange claims. He says that coffee whitens the teeth rather than darken them, as some people think. Not true, okay? That it's useful for children because they can't drink wine and alcohol, so give them coffee. But to his credit, he does say that there are some people for whom coffee is not suitable, especially those people who are, we would call them very highly strung or hyperactive. People who have a very quick metabolism, right? He says that those people are bilious, and he's, of course, using the old humoral classification here. But he says, in people who are thin and wiry, it causes their blood to be actually too thin. The nutrients transpire too quickly, and ultimately their spirits dissipate and at an unhealthy rate. So really thin, highly strung people should not drink coffee, because it's going to make them more wired, right? But he says for overweight people and those with thick fluids or slow movements of the animal machine, I love he calls it that. He's trying to think of it as a mechanism. He says it's fine, it's ideal. Coffee's great for people who want to lose weight. It's really only dangerous for those that are highly strung and dried up, and then maybe they'll be prone to sterility. It doesn't refute that entirely, but it's for people who are naturally have clogs and things, or are sluggish or slow. Coffee perks them up, right? So I'm not going to linger on the detail of the other two drinks yet. Dufour actually makes much of the same claims for tea, and he qualifies chocolate by saying it's cold and more terrestrial, and there's a very different argument that takes place in connection to coffee. But what I want to assert here, and this is my idea. I don't know whether historians of medicine would necessarily follow me, but I think finding these new plants, and not just these, things that are recreational drugs, that's what they are, coffee, tea, chocolate, eventually tobacco, a handful of other things too, sarsaparilla, sassafras, guaiac root, all these new things. The ancients didn't know of these. They had no way to classify them. And I think ultimately what this does is it kind of breaks the authority of humoral medicine when physicians start arguing about the qualities of various new drugs. They begin to say, well, maybe that old system doesn't really work so well. Maybe we need new tools like chemistry, like physics, to understand the properties of how drugs behave in our body, and so in a sense, the discovery of the New World and the inability to classify all these new drugs really, I think, helps in making the humoral system outdated. And eventually it does disappear. And modern science, of course, replaces it at the end of the 17th century. We're almost there. So what we're going to come back with next time is I will talk about these other drinks, because they're classified together, but they have very unique histories. They come from different places, of course. Tea from China and Asia, and coffee from the New World, and they have very different social uses. They don't all become the same thing, and of course, all of them are very important in global history because they are planted all around the world and become major cornerstones of European trade and empire. And I'll weave that story in the next few lectures, and I'll see you, I guess, next week.